Hi, Mom, seriously, I'm trying to make a video. Can you give me 1 minute? Let's try this again. Hi, and welcome to the Spring Hill Equine Seminar. If you're new, like me, don't worry, it's gonna be fun. We'll give everyone a chance to grab some food and get comfy, and then we'll get started. Mom, I'm working here. You're always embarrassing me. Okay, I think we're about ready to go.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Spring Hill Equine's second goat seminar. If you missed the first one, it is on our YouTube channel, I believe. It is Goats 101. Today we're going to do Goats 201, Advanced Goat Studies. I'm Dr. Spizak. I'm the mixed animal veterinarian at Spring Hill Equine, and I'm here today to talk about a little bit more advanced topics with goat management. We are going to cover a little bit of sheep topics too. Generally, they kind of all go hand in hand. If you guys have any questions while we're talking, feel free to drop them in the comments below, and we will work on getting to them towards the end. All right. So first thing we're going to talk about seems very basic, but I find that it is a little bit more of an advanced topic because first-time goat owners don't always think about that. That is, what is your goat for? What was your goat bred for, meant for, evolved for? There are all different types of goats. Some examples here are our Toggenburg. That's one of the oldest dairy goat breeds in the world. So they're a dairy animal. They're meant to make milk. In the top right there, we've got boar goats. Those are what we determine as meat goats, meaning that they're typically food-producing animals where we would actually eat their meat for sustenance. And then we've got an Angora goat in the bottom, very cute, not very common in Florida because of that long fiber, but that is a fiber goat. So it is somewhat similar to a sheep, but it's actually a totally unique fiber. It's not a wool, it's a fiber, and that is their purpose. So that means that you probably don't want to try to milk a boar goat. Toggenburg goat's probably not going to taste very good, and I wouldn't do either with a fiber goat other than shear them. So depending on what you want out of your goats is going to depend on what types of breeds or crosses you are going to want to purchase. Now, if you just want pet goats, then that's fine. There's a lot of great goats that can be pet goats, but you may not need to go to a specific dairy goat producer and pay, $700 for a top-of-the-line dairy goat if you just want a pet. So one of those things that's really, really important to consider, and if you want your animals to have a purpose, then we should try to have purpose-bred animals, basically. All right, so this is Goat 201 Advanced Goat Studies. Again, please watch Goat 101 for a lot of information on this. But if you know me, you know it is impossible for me to talk about goats and sheep without mentioning the FAMACHA score, which is what is shown here. Every single person that has ever brought me a goat or sheep has heard me ask them, have you ever heard of a FAMACHA score? So this card here and this demonstration in the image is showing what we call a FAMACHA score. That is how we measure the parasite burden of our goats and sheep. Goats and sheep, their biggest killer in the Southeast US at the very least are parasites. Now, you've also all probably heard me say this, every goat and sheep has parasites. We're never going to get them to zero. So what we have to do is we have to manage them and maintain them and work on their resilience, meaning their ability to handle those parasites. So the way to do that is we check a FAMACHA score. So as shown here in the card, we have got a 1 to 5 score. A 1 is nice and dark red to dark pink, really bright and healthy. And a 5 down at the bottom, it's like the same color as the rest of the card. It's white, it's not healthy, it's no good. So I always tell people a 1 and a 2, great, love it, leave them alone. A 3 or a 4, get me a fecal sample, bring that in, let me do a fecal egg count, and we're going to make a decision based on that. A 5, you call me that day, or if I'm not available, you take them to an emergency facility that day. A 5 is a very sick goat or sheep. Even if they're standing up and walking around, a 5 is a sick goat or sheep. So that's my little interplay there. I can't talk about goats and sheep without talking about FAMACHA score. If you guys have any questions, drop them below. Demonstrated in the picture is how to do a FAMACHA score. So as a reminder, we're going to cover the eyelid down. We're going to push the eyeball in, and we're going to pull the lower eyelid out, and our beautiful mucous membrane will pop into view. All right. So handling and facilities. This is a big one once we start getting into having larger numbers of goats and sheep. There are plenty of very friendly goats out there. There are also plenty of goats that don't want to have anything to do with me when I come to poke and prod them and take their temperature. They are escape artists, and they are very, very good at getting out of all kinds of pens. The famous quote is, make a fence, throw some water at it, and if the water gets through, so will the goat. So they are definitely escape artists. Having good handling facilities is absolutely vital for them. They may come up to you for treats when you're not trying to mess with them, but if you are trying to mess with them, they probably won't come up to you for treats, and they may break through your fences trying to get away from you or get away from me if I'm there to see them when they're sick. Along with that, they should be handled regularly. Goats that are handled regularly and sheep that are handled regularly tend to be more tame and more willing to allow us to do things. The FAMACHA score, talked about in the last slide, is a great way to do that. I do recommend doing FAMACHA scores in goats once a week and in sheep every time you handle them. So for goats, we should handle them a minimum of once per month. I think goats are adorable, and I want to handle them every single time that I'm around them. So 7 to 8 times a day sounds great to me, but at a very minimum once a month. And then sheep, a little bit less often. They tend to be a little bit more of a want to stay away from people and be on their own, but an absolute minimum of 2 to 3 times per year. But honestly, the more the better, the more tame they're going to get. The more handling you do with both, the easier it'll be. This is a demonstration if it plays. This is one of our technicians. She recently adopted a goat, and she is halter training him. She has only had him for a couple of weeks, and you can see he walks on a halter absolutely beautifully. I asked her if I could video this to show an example that it can be done. You can train a goat to be very comfortable with people and very easily handleable. This just takes time, positive reinforcement, treats. Goats love treats. Animal crackers are a big favorite. So you can definitely train them. Halter training is always an option, or goats can also walk on collars and leashes. Either I think is generally acceptable. You just want to make sure it's fitted to them appropriately so that they're not going to get stuck on it in the pasture. All right, switching topics a little bit. We have some acronyms up here, which you may or may not have heard of. Hopefully, if you have any large amount of goats, you've heard of these things. So FARAD is Food Animal Residue Avoidance Databank. It's basically a big organization that helps us across the US to avoid there being antibiotics and other medications in the food supply. Now, why am I talking about this if you just have pet goats? Because in the United States, goats, sheep, and cattle are all considered food-producing animals. It does not matter if you never intend to eat them. Their name is Betsy. You love them forever. You will never eat them in a million years. Legally, federally, they are considered food-producing animals. That means that me, as a licensed veterinarian, and you, as their owner and their producer, need to follow the federal regulations. This is vitally important, vitally serious, and unfortunately there are a lot of goat and sheep owners and producers out there that are flagrantly disobeying the federal regulations when it comes to these animals. So this is my PSA out there. There's some pretty strict laws, and this is part of why you want to have a good relationship with a veterinarian for your goats and your sheep and any of your food-producing animals to know what the rules are, what the laws are. The second acronym here is ELDU, that's extra label drug use, and the caveat for that is that we can only do that under the direction of a veterinarian. So in the US, I just looked up this number, I believe there are something like 70 drugs approved for the use in goats and 25 approved for the use in sheep, and that is it. And I promise there's a lot more drugs that get used for those animals. And so basically if a drug is approved for the use, then we have a little bit more leeway with it. If it's not approved, then it's considered extra label drug use, and that means that a veterinarian needs to be the one to decide how, when, and how much of it is used. As the owner, it does not fall under your purview. So that is why, despite the fact that there are some of these medications available over the counter, it is not appropriate to use them in your animals without direction of a veterinarian. Also, a little caveat, a lot of those antibiotics are actually coming off the shelves this year, so that's the federal government trying to work on that. My big bold statement here is that compounded drugs, that's a specific type of drug that basically it's not a labeled product, but it's a product that's kind of manufactured in a compounding pharmacy of some sort, are completely illegal in food animals. Again, that means cattle, sheep, and goats. The sort of big example of this, and part of the reason why this slide is on here, is there is a product called toltrazuril that is used in some of our non-food producing animals that has been used quite a lot in goats and sheep for coccidia treatment. I'm sure a lot of you, especially that have a lot of goats, are aware of that medication. That is illegal to use in these animals, despite the fact that, yes, it does work. It is illegal. There are other options, and a veterinarian should not be prescribing that to you. So we're going to move away from the serious things, but that was my serious PSA for everybody with our food producing animals. So we've got our super cute, adorable little goat kid down here, and we love it, and we want to make more of them, right? Because we love goat kids. But not every absolutely adorable goat or sheep needs to be bred. There are so many of them in the world. There are lots of people breeding them. We want to do it in a smart way. We want to have a plan. So here are just some very brief do's and don'ts. Caveat here is if you are planning on breeding them, please speak to me if I'm your veterinarian or to your veterinarian for your goats and sheep and have a plan specific to your herd or flock with them. So first point there, do have a plan for your offspring. Goats and sheep, twins is their standard. So you're going to double your population each time that you're breeding, right? So expect at least 2 out of every goat or sheep that you breed. They can have triplets. They can have quads. At the University of Florida, they once had a doe that had 8 babies in one litter. So they can have lots and lots and lots of babies. And you need to have a plan for all of them. Are you going to keep them all? Are you going to sell them? Are you using them for meat? What are you doing with them? But you need to have a plan, preferably before the buck and the doe get together and make their plan. So yes, have a plan. You do also need to have a plan for dystocia. For those of you who don't know, dystocia means difficult birth. That's a big, wide term, just like colic is a big, wide term for abdominal pain in horses, and it can have 25 different causes. Dystocia means difficult birth. The vast majority of goats and sheep are going to give birth all on their own. They don't need any help from us, but sometimes they do need help from us. Sometimes it's as simple as, she's got her butt stuck in a corner and you just have to move her butt out of the way because she was kind of a silly sheep and she didn't move her own butt out of the way, and you can help her out. Other times I have to come out, I have to do some manual manipulation in there, and I can get the baby out. Other times it involves a C-section where we have to anesthetize them, we have to go to surgery, we have to open their uterus, get the babies out, give mom lots of antibiotics and drugs and anesthesia and all the things, and hope that we can save mom and save baby. Other times it's really bad and mom's in labor for a long time and her uterus ruptures and they don't come back from that, unfortunately. So there's a lot of possibilities that can happen. Breeding animals is not a given. Breeding animals is a choice that you are making, and it's not something that you have to do, and it's something that you need to have a plan for. So again, dystocia, it may be that a veterinarian can come out to you. Very often a veterinarian cannot come out to you and you need to haul your animals somewhere, whether that's into a private practice clinic like us, whether that's over to a university or another facility, something like that. But you need to have a plan for how and when and who to haul them, and have some budget for that. A dystocia, obviously it's gonna be different in different practices, different areas, but certainly in the couple hundreds of dollars, and C-sections can get into the couple thousands of dollars. So have a plan. This is my little sort of seems like a random point on here, the polled goats, but do not breed polled goats. Polled animals are animals that are naturally without horns. You may be familiar with certain breeds of cattle are considered polled, so they're born without horns. In cattle, we can breed them that way, and it works really, really well, and we have entire breeds that we never have to worry about horns on. In goats, it's actually quite interesting. If you're a science nerd, it's quite interesting, but the horned and not horned genes in goats is linked to their their sexual dimorphism. And so polled goats are much more likely to be intersex, meaning that they are a pseudo-hermaphrodite is what we call them, but basically they're going to be a sterile animal. They may look like a girl, they may look like a boy, but they are not going to be able to reproduce. And so if we breed, the more polled animals we breed, the higher likelihood that we produce those animals. And as I said, breeding, we want to make the breed better, and so there's no reason to produce intersex animals if we can avoid it. The next point seems rather obvious, but not obvious to everybody. So don't breed brothers and sisters together, and try not to breed parents and offspring. In some very specific situations, we do things called line breeding, where we are breeding animals of a similar genetic nature, but that is not something that should be done on a regular basis at all. We don't want to mix our gene pools very strongly. And the siblings caveat in here, little boy buckling goats can be fertile at 3 months of age. So, and they will happily breed their mother or their sisters. So for little boy bucklings, if you again, have a plan for them. So if they're going to be pets and you want to wait to castrate them till they're a little bit older, they need to be separated from their female counterparts. If you are planning to eat them, we generally castrate them earlier than 3 months of age. If you're planning to sell them, separate them out, whatever you're planning to do with them. But again, 3 months of age, they will happily make more of themselves, and that's not our best option. And then our last point here, goats and sheep, the mothers cannot control the size of their babies. The size of the babies is controlled by the father's genes. So unfortunately, I have seen this happen too many times, where we breed a very small, very cute, let's say a pygmy or a dwarf doe to a larger buck. And almost always that results in a severe dystocia that needs a C-section, and it may take the life of the mother. It's a pretty rough thing. Question?
If you're good with that.
Yeah.
Question from Facebook Land.
Yeah.
I thought polled with polled had a high risk of hermaphrodism, but polled with horn, the risk is very slim.
So the question is about the polled goats. I thought polled with polled had a high risk of hermaphrodism, but polled with horns, the risk is very slim. Certainly polled with polled, there is a higher risk. However, the way that the genetics work, that intersex sort of gene is still a carrier on there. So anytime you are breeding that polled animal, you are propagating that intersex gene, or potentially propagating it. Unless we're doing genetic testing, we don't know for sure. It's not always 100% linked. But it's one of those things where there are plenty of goats out there. We can and should avoid breeding any that are polled, because we do not need more of them in our area. Does that sound fair? Perfect. So don't breed large bucks to small does, or large rams to small ewes. All right, a little brief interlude on raising kids. So this kind of goes in with our plan for offspring. Part of that plan might involve you being mom. It's super fun for a little passel of little goat kids or lambs. So a lot of dams, a lot of moms, they do just fine, certainly with 2, and a lot of them can do 3 or 4 kids just fine, but some can't. And they may need help. And so certainly sometimes we need to pull some off if she's got even sometimes 2 or more than 2, and we've got to bottle feed some of them. The other thing that we have to worry about, and this is again goes back to our last slide, is that we might lose mom. She might have a major issue during childbirth, and we might lose her, and we might end up with still having live babies, and then we become mom and we need to raise the babies. Colostrum is absolutely vital to the survival of baby goats and sheep and most animals. So they absolutely need colostrum. This goes for, you need to make sure that happens regardless of whether mom is raising her or whether you are raising them. We want to do 3 ounces of colostrum per pound of body weight. Kind of in the first 24 hours. This divided into multiple meals is kind of if you're the one giving the colostrum. If they are able to nurse from mom, they'll divide it into multiple meals themselves. They'll nurse a little bit, they'll play, and they'll sleep. They'll nurse a little bit, they'll play, and they'll sleep. It's absolutely adorable. but we need to make sure that they get colostrum. That means that when the kid or the lambs are born, we need to watch them, and we need to make sure that they are nursing from mom within the first couple of hours of birth. And if they're not, then we need to talk about supplementing colostrum. And supplementing colostrum, the best thing, so if you don't have mom's colostrum, the best thing is another goat or sheep's colostrum. So if you have another animal in the herd, sometimes if a mom has only one baby, we can take a little bit of her colostrum and we can freeze it and kind of save it for, for future use. So if you've got another animal's colostrum in the herd, that's fantastic. If not, we've got colostrum replacers kind of on the market that we can use. You want to be careful. There are both colostrum replacers and colostrum supplements. If you need to replace colostrum, you need to buy a colostrum replacer. This is a chart that kind of goes over if you are needing to bottle feed. Then this is kind of the general recommendations, and so kind of how much you want to make sure gets in the animal. And again, similar thing for bottle feeding and for milk. Milk from mom is the best. Milk from another animal of the same herd is the sort of second best. And then after that, we move down to either milk replacers. I will say some goat kids don't do amazing on milk replacers and do happen to do better on cow's milk. But that's kind of a case-by-case situation. So something to talk to your veterinarian about as far as how your goat kid is doing. You do want to pay attention to this, how many times per day. They do have small stomachs and they will overeat. And so we don't want to just sort of let them make the choice because they won't make a good one. So that is kind of our general bottle feeding schedule. And, this can involve overnight care, things like that. Another caveat for kids, newborn kids or lambs, you want to kind of have a little bit of a kit for that. So towels, gloves, iodine is what I like to dip these guys' navels in. Chlorhexidine is another option. But when they come out, they're going to have their little belly button and there's going to be a big long string hanging, and you do want to dip that with iodine every couple of hours for that first 24 hours. That's to try to prevent infection. People call it navel ill, but it's basically a sepsis that they can get because that umbilical cord, that belly button is kind of open to the world for the first 24 hours. So it's really important that we keep that clean. And I talked about this a little bit in the last talk, but we also want to make sure we are kidding or lambing in a clean, dry pen, somewhere that is a sort of designated area, if at all possible. We will sometimes have surprises. But. All right, disbudding. Another very common thing that happens in the goat world, very often done by goat owners and producers themselves. And that is something that if you know what you're doing, I think that is something that can happen and is acceptable. But the caveat of that is that you know what you're doing and you're comfortable with it. So what disbudding is, for those of you who don't know, is removing those horns, because again, we can't breed polled goats, so all of our goats have horns. So it is removing the horn buds at a very young age. Generally, a hot iron tool is used, and it creates these copper rings that you can see here in this image. It's very common practice in cattle as well, and so some people have moved that practice over. The big caveat is that we do it very differently in goats than we do in cattle. Cattle's skulls are nice and thick, like an inch thick, and goat skulls are paper thin. So these are potentially some maybe disturbing images, but I felt it was good to share. This is a study that was done on disbudding at the University of Iowa, and the goat kids were disbudded for different periods of time on the different horns, and then that is their brains that is being shown there. And so our top image, the one on the left, was for 20 seconds. So the disbudding iron was held on for 20 seconds. And the one on the right, the iron was held on for 15 seconds. And if you look at the black arrows, and hopefully you guys in person can see them, but if you look at the black arrows, we're seeing some red marks. That's a brain. Red marks on the brain. This can give them what's called meningitis, which is infection and inflammation of the brain, and it can certainly kill them. On the bottom image, the one on the left was held on for 5 seconds, and the one on the right was also held on for 15 seconds. And you can see this bottom one, its skull was probably a little thinner because it's actually got some like almost necrosis of the brain happening on that 15-second one. But if you'll notice, the 5-second one doesn't have any marks. What that is telling us, and what the studies have shown us, is that timing is incredibly important when it comes to disbudding. So there needs to be a very hard time limit, and that specific time limit for your breed and your animals is something to talk about with your veterinarian if you are going to be disbudding yourself, or to go to a veterinarian that is comfortable with disbudding goats and not just disbudding calves. But it is very important to have that hard time limit. Will that sometimes give us what are called scurs, which are horn bud remnants? Yes. Will that keep goats alive? Also yes. So if we go above that time limit, we put them at risk of brain infection. And I would much rather have a goat with some scurs than a goat with brain infection. Some other alternatives to disbudding are these adorable images here. So goats do great with horns. I mean, yeah, you can disbud them. Goats do fantastically with horns. If you teach them from a young age that they don't get to headbutt people, they won't headbutt people. They can learn that skill. They can learn to play with their goat brethren and not play with people in the same manner. And if they do try to get a little bit rough with you, pool noodles work fantastic, and they can be in fun seasonal colors. We love it. Tennis balls also work fantastic. I've also seen for goats that like to get their horns stuck in things, I've seen people tape like a dowel between the two horns to sort of prevent them. So there's a lot of really good options besides disbudding. It's something that we can totally do, but it's something we need to be really, really safe about. And I would recommend a veterinarian doing it, or at the very least a veterinarian having a long conversation with you about doing it if you're gonna do it yourself. Okay, moving on. This last little bit, I know I've thrown a lot at you guys. We're gonna talk about a couple of infectious diseases of sheep and goats. There's a big three. We're gonna talk about all three of them kind of very briefly. I think I kind of teased this in the last one, but didn't have time to talk about it. So I'm gonna do my little spiel about each of these diseases, but certainly if anybody has any questions at the end, we can talk about it. Or if you have specific questions about your animals, we can definitely talk about them at another date. So our first one is Johne's disease. This is a chronic disease of goats and sheep, also of cattle. You've probably potentially heard about it in cattle. It is caused by a mycobacterium type species. And what this disease does, it is very insidious. They tend to get infected when they're very young, but they don't actually show signs until they are at least 2 years of age, and often much older than that. So this is typically a disease that we're going to see presenting at an older age, but they didn't just get it. They were infected when they were very young. And so if we do have big herds and we're bringing lots of animals into our herd and things like that, testing for this disease is a good plan. So this is kind of our iceberg of Johne's disease here. So at the bottom, the very largest group is the animals that are exposed and are infected, meaning that organism is living inside of them, but they're not shedding it, they're not sick. We have absolutely no way of knowing that they've got it. A little bit less animals than that, we're going to have animals that are shedding bacteria, meaning they're getting their friends sick. It's shed in the feces, so they are putting it out into the world for everyone to share. However, when we test them, so there's a blood test and a fecal PCR test. We're talking about a blood test here in these testings. So when we test them, they're negative because it's not showing up in their blood, it's just being shed in their feces. A little bit less animals than that, we've got ones that are still shedding bacteria, but the blood test is going to come back positive. And then finally but they were all those animals are still healthy. They're healthy, they're eating, they've got good weight, doing all the things. A little bit less animals than that. We've got ones, we call it subtly sick. They may be losing a little bit of weight. Maybe they're producing a little bit less milk if they're dairy animals. They're just not totally themselves, and they will test positive. Those are our first kind of clues that we might have something going on. And then at the very top, the smallest population of animals are ones that are obviously sick. They come to me. They have diarrhea, they're skin and bones. They don't want to eat, they're lethargic. Those are ones where they're sick. Unfortunately, there is no treatment or cure for Johne's disease. That's kind of the big thing to know. So testing for it, trying to make sure it doesn't come into our herds is the best thing to do. Certainly we can manage these animals if they're pet animals and they're in a closed herd and they're not spreading it to anybody else. We can certainly manage them and try to keep them comfortable. But if you do have a working production herd, the way that we manage this is it's called test and cull. Cull meaning remove them from the herd, because we do not want it to spread. It can, like I said, it's fecal oral route, so it can spread to everybody in the herd, and it can spread from you to other animals too. So you're messing with them, you get it on your shoes, your feet, your hands, whatever. You can spread it to other animals. The other thing that is not elucidated totally yet, but something that I felt was worth mentioning, is that there's some concern of Johne's disease in milk actually having a potential link with Crohn's disease in humans. And so again, we don't have like all the answers on that yet, but especially if you've got dairy animals and you're milking them, it's something to just really be aware of and consider testing. My recommendation is doing fecal PCRs, because as you can see, the shedding bacteria, that's going to show up on our fecal PCRs much earlier than the blood test is going to show. So for me, when I'm monitoring at the herd level, I recommend fecal PCRs, and we can actually bulk those samples and we can do a bunch of them at the same time. And then if we find a positive, we can go do individual samples. But again, conversation to have with your veterinarian. All right, this next one, CL, caseous lymphadenitis. Some of you guys might have heard of that. Our little blue dots on our super adorable goat in this picture are examples of locations where we might find CL. So what caseous lymphadenitis is, it is an infection within the lymph node. And so we will find an abscessed lymph node. Sometimes we can have abscesses in other places, so these locations are not the end-all be-all, but typically it's lymphadenitis, lymph node. Typically it's in a lymph node. And so we have got an organism in there, and it will create a hard, gross abscess that will be full of yellow, chunky, cheesy, sorry for the food description, material. Super gross. It generally doesn't affect the actual goat a ton, at least the first couple times, but it is so contagious. It gets in the soil, it gets on the ground, it gets on the barn aisle. It is super contagious. So we want to keep it out of our herd to the best of our ability. If you find a lump or a bump somewhere on your goat or your sheep, my recommendation is to have a veterinarian come out to you and sterilely drain the abscess and test that material. What you do not want to do is take a blade or your pocket knife or whatever and pop it and get it all over. One, that's painful, and don't do that. And two, you're going to get that that organism all over your property. That stuff lives in the soil for years. Years and years and years. Little side note on sheep. Sheep actually tend to get internal abscesses, so we actually very rarely see abscesses on the locations where it's pictured on the goat and sheep. They tend to get them, unfortunately, like in their lungs and in their intestines and things like that. So much harder to diagnose in sheep, but it does exist. There is a test for this as far as a screening tool. It's not fantastic. I think it's not a bad idea to do the screening test. It's a blood test, but it's not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. So your best bet is to use good biosecurity, have a closed herd, and anytime you've got a lump or a bump on a goat or sheep, call your veterinarian and have them test that material. What we do is we sterilely drain it and we send it out to a lab and we culture it. All right. Our last of the big three infectious diseases of goats and sheep, we've got caprine, that means goat, arthritis, and encephalitis. Arthritis, inflammation of the joints, most of us are probably familiar with that because we've got it, and encephalitis meaning neurologic disease. So this is actually a virus. So the other two were bacterial type organisms. This one's actually a virus. This one is spread definitely through the milk, definitely through blood, and it can sometimes be spread actually in utero as well. So just straight babies born with it. This is a virus that they have for life. So if they do contract it, we don't get to get rid of it, unfortunately. But it is less likely to be transmitted. So if we're not milking animals off of it, we're not sharing milk from that animal, and we're not doing blood from one animal to the other, which we never should be, no sharing needles, then we are unlikely to spread it. So we can certainly have these animals in our herd, but it's a good idea to know that they're positive. The encephalitis component of this virus is typically found in young animals. So if we've ever got really sick babies and we don't know the status of their moms, then this is something we might be testing for. But more commonly, at least in my population of patients that I see, is the arthritis component of it. And that's what's pictured here. This is called knee walking. It's basically they're unwilling to bear weight on their front feet. And that's typically because they've got excruciating severe arthritis in those joints. And it hurts to walk. And that's something that will develop over time. It does develop earlier in these guys, the arthritis, than like a normal old animal just develops arthritis. And again, unfortunately, there's not a true cure for it, right? It's a virus that's going to live in them forever. There is a sort of sister virus of sheep called ovine progressive pneumonia. And both of those are sort of considered small ruminant viruses. They do somewhat similar things, but CAE is by far more common. So again, testing the herd, especially if you're breeding animals, testing the herd, it's a blood test, it's relatively simple to do. Really great plan. If you do have positive animals, again, have a plan for your offspring, right? My idea would be not to breed them. But if you do happen to breed them, definitely not using their milk for the babies. So not letting the babies nurse is kind of your best bet there. So those are kind of our big three of the diseases. There's way more information about all of them, but I have to stop talking at some point. So that's kind of my small spiel on all of them. And it's something that we need to test for because there's no cures for any of them. So just really good to know if you've got goats and sheep. Oh, maybe. I think I had one more. Well, I put a thank you slide on, but it didn't go onto this one. But we have questions. Deworming spiel. Love it. I love a good deworming spiel. So good at it. So deworming. So the question was about dosing for ivermectin. So first of all, dosing is going to be an individual conversation for each animal with your veterinarian. But the big thing that I always talk about in my deworming spiel is the dosing for goats and sheep and cows are all very different. The goat dose tends to be at least twice the sheep dose. And a lot of our deworming products, if they are labeled for goats or sheep, they're labeled for sheep only. And so if we go by what's on the label, we are underdosing our animals. Again, this is for sure covered in Goat 101, but parasite resistance is one of the biggest issues, and it's why parasites are our biggest killers of goats and sheep. Great ways to get parasite resistance are to underdose our dewormers and basically not give enough dewormer to actually kill our parasites. Ivermectin is also, it's one of those really popular dewormers, right? We use it all the time. That means it's super resistant. That means that the parasites don't respond to it. So very often, especially again in my population of patients, ivermectin, I may as well be giving them some apple juice. It does not do a thing for their parasites. So we've got other dewormers, and actually very often we've got to do combinations of dewormers, so two different classes of dewormers together at the same time to try to hit the parasites from two different sides. Also on the dewormer spiel, pour-on dewormers do not work well in goats and sheep, so we do not recommend pour-on dewormers. We only recommend, or injectable dewormers, we only recommend oral dewormers, and you want to make sure that you are getting your dosing ideally from a veterinarian or from a reputable source that knows that the goat dosing is different than the sheep and cow dosing. So, but see Goat 101 for a little bit more info on that.
Well, you answered the next question right after that, which was not sure if I missed this, but what is your view on worming?
So it was what is my view on worming? That was sort of my view on worming in a very short spiel. Again, I waxed poetic on it in our Goat 101, so you need to go check that out for sure. All right, I've got another question. Is it true that goats eat everything? Goats love to eat. Goats do eat a lot of different things. I don't think they eat tin cans as much as is portrayed in the cartoons, but they do eat lots and lots of things. And we do have to be a little bit careful that we keep them away from things we don't want them to eat. So we don't want them to get into other animals' food, like our horse feed or our chicken feed or anything like that. We don't want to get into any types of toxic plants. Some of the really big ones specifically for goats and sheep are azaleas and rhododendrons. Those are relatively popular flower, plants that people use to decorate their yards. You can tell I'm a big landscaper. But those are relatively popular. Those will make goats and sheep very, very, very sick. So goats and sheep, their bulk of their diet should be forage. Generally, if you've got enough pasture, that is pasture. They are fantastic at clearing space for you and clearing woodlands. And then if we do need to supplement them with concentrates, we want to use a goat or sheep specific food. We don't want to use horse food. We don't want to use cow food. We definitely don't want to use an all stock food, because all stock means not good for any stock. So we want to use goat or sheep specific things. But yes, they do love to eat lots of things. I think I said this, but animal crackers tend to be a big favorite treat-wise. And then marshmallows and fig Newtons also. Those are all safe and they're really cute when they eat them. So it's a good plan. Yeah.
I remember reading that if they do get into something they shouldn't eat, like we have milkweed and we keep them away, and same with like avocado trees.
Yeah.
They have tasted it. They have ate avocado trees. They never showed any problem, but I read like charcoal, if there was something they ate and they were sick, is that something I should keep on hand, and like what form, like how do I?
Sure, yeah. So the question is about if they do get into something that they weren't supposed to eat, sort of is charcoal the thing to keep on hand? Is that the, sort of magical cure? Charcoal works for some things and it doesn't work for others. So, it's going to depend specifically on kind of what they ate. I would say that if they do get into something they're not supposed to eat, a call to your veterinarian is your best bet. That doesn't always mean that we're going to come out there and we're going to see them, but we're going to have a conversation with you about hopefully what they ate, some idea of how much they ate, and kind of let that guide us. I will say goats tend to be a little bit more resilient to things. Most of them do, at least, compared to like horses or cows or even sheep. But we do still want to, again, try our best to keep them away from toxic plants and toxic things like that, for sure. Things like chicken feed or horse feed, though, that is for sure a vet visit, because we need to, charcoal doesn't do anything for that. We need to get it out of their stomach. Any other questions? Yeah, go for it.
All of our goats, some more than others, they get a lot of boogers in their nose.
Sure.
And
Why?
why do they get so many boogers?
Yeah, so the question is, her goats, all of them get lots of boogers and lots of snotty noses, and why is that? So the short answer is that goats and sheep and cows and other ruminants are not athletes, and their respiratory system isn't quite the best, especially when compared to like horses that are athletes. And they have giant lungs. We ask them to do lots of things. So goats and sheep and cows and all of the ruminants they're quite susceptible to respiratory disease, but a snotty nose doesn't necessarily mean that they have true respiratory disease that we need to treat. So basically their lungs are a little bit small. Their tracheal clearance doesn't work quite as well as other species. They've got relatively small nasal passages compared to kind of their body size. And they salivate a ton, and so they're just producing a lot of sort of mucus and fluid in their head. So a happy, eating, bright goat, sheep, or cow that has a little bit of nasal discharge, especially if it's not super colorful, like it's sort of clear to maybe like a light green or light yellow, I don't tend to be too worried about them. If you are at all concerned, you want to take a temperature. That's a rectal temperature. You can use a digital thermometer from Publix or Walgreens or wherever you want. Try to get the shorter, not the minute ones, but like the 8-second ones, because they lose patience. So take a temperature and call your veterinarian with that temperature and tell them the signs and symptoms, and they'll kind of help you make a plan. Coughing is an extra symptom that we want to know about, and so that may mean that we're a little bit closer to something like a true respiratory disease. And then certainly if they are not eating, or if they're have so much discharge and are breathing so hard that they don't want to do anything but sit there and try to breathe, that's a worry for sure. But if they're happy, generally healthy otherwise, and have some nasal discharge, most of the time I'm not going to worry about that. One thing that I will try is wetting down their forage, their hay and their grain. Sometimes they're just very sensitive to dust. Yeah. Yeah.
Do those get calmed down by music?
Do goats get calmed down by music? I think so. I get calmed down by music, so I bet they do too. Yeah, goats for sure. I was gonna say goats and sheep. Goats are really smart. Sheep maybe a little less so, but goats are really smart animals, and they tend to like what we like. They love spending time with people. Like we showed in the video, you can train them. I've seen goats clicker trained really well. There are trick goats out there, and I bet they absolutely love music. I think they want to hang out with people, and they want to do anything that you want to do with them. So yes, I think goats like music. Yeah. Okay.
Baycox is what my vet recommends for coccidia. Are there other things? I feel like this is a vet conversation. Baycox. And then she has also a question about how toxic is cherry for goats.
Okay. So Baycox, the question was Baycox, vets recommend Baycox. That is toltrazuril. So if you are in the US, that should not be a recommendation. If you are outside of the US, that is probably fine because I believe it is legal in most other countries. But here, that is a compounded product and is not something that goats or food animals can have. So yeah, but that's definitely a conversation with your specific vet for sure.
And
How toxic is cherry?
off the tree directly.
Gotcha. So how toxic is cherry sort of green off the tree? Cherry is one of those things that they do tend to need to eat quite a lot of to get a toxicity. Do I want them to eat any of it? Not really. But eating a little bit off the tree, especially because they'll probably eat all the low branches, quickly, and then they won't be able to get up to the higher branches. I don't tend to worry too much. But certainly, if you've got a toxic plant, you want to know about it. And if you see anything, so things like that would be like lethargy, not breathing super well, not wanting to eat. All of those would be signs to call your veterinarian for sure, and let them know that if you know about a toxic plant, let them know that you've got it there.
Apparently there's a weed called ground cherry. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Apparently it's a weed called ground cherry, not a cherry tree. I am not familiar with ground cherry weed, to be totally honest. So I can look that up and I can put that in the comments later. But yeah, I don't know anything about a ground cherry weed, unfortunately. I'm not a herbologist. I wish I was.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to summarize here.
You're good.
So she has she's a 2-year-old goat. The winter's been exceptionally cold. She's obviously not from Florida. She's in a stall at night that's bedded with lots of straw and shavings, but she shivers a lot. Like, is that bad, and what should she do?
Sure. So this is a question about a goat where it's apparently winter's a thing somewhere besides Florida. I don't know anything about that, but apparently the winter's very cold, and the goat is in a stall at night, bedded with straw and shavings, but she's shivering. Is that something we have to worry about? So shivering certainly indicates that the animal's cold. Goats are kind of like horses in that they ferment things in their guts, and so that fermentation can keep them warm. So we want to make sure that there is forage. That means hay of some sort, hay or grass, but if they're in their stall, it's going to be hay, in front of them at all times. So if you've got a cold goat, definitely keeping them full of hay is going to be your best bet. The other thing I would say is potentially insulating the stall a little bit more. Worst case, goat coat. Goats in coats. Real cute. But yes, shivering is an indication that they're cold. Is that going to make them sick? Potentially not, but I would try to work on something, get some creative ideas to address the cold in the stall for sure.
Apparently she's in Colorado and they had a few nights near zero, which sounds horrible.
A few nights near zero in Colorado. That sounds not so fun, but yeah.
I'm going to combine 2 comments about alfalfa.
Okay.
In particular involving an intact male and a wether.
Okay.
She's trying to keep them busy while her horse eats. Is it okay to feed them a few alfalfa pellets with mineral, like loose mineral? And then, can boy goats eat alfalfa?
Gotcha. So the question is kind of a combination of questions about alfalfa hay or alfalfa pellets as well, and boy goats. And so we're talking about both intact males and castrated males called wethers in the goat world. This I think was also in my Goat 101, but castrated males are at very high risk of urethral blockage. So basically their urethra where they pee from getting blocked, closed down, and not being able to express any urine, and that is a life-threatening condition. Diet is one of the major factors in that. There are a few different types of stones, different aspects of diet affect different types of stones, and some of the types of stones, unfortunately, we can't do anything about. But alfalfa is one of those that can cause some of those types of stones, so I do try to be careful with it in male goats and sheep. Bucks or rams, so intact males, have a little bit lower risk of urethral blockage, so I tend to be a little bit more lenient when it comes to kind of their diet, because the influence of testosterone keeps that urethra a little bit wider, but I still want to be careful. Weathered or castrated males, I would try to choose something else besides alfalfa pellets if I could. Timothy pellets would be an easy switch, similar thing, probably a similar price, and it would be less likely has less of a high calcium level and just less likely to kind of lead to that mineral buildup. But it's definitely goat and sheep individual dependent for sure. Castrated males, we want to try to avoid grain. We want to keep them on forage-only diets, and we want to do our best to avoid alfalfa. Mostly castrated males don't have jobs other than to be adorable pets, so they don't need a lot. They kind of just live on the ground outside, and they tend to get plenty fat doing that. So we really don't need to give them a lot of things. If you do want to give them something that is like a grain, like a treat, like I said, Timothy pellets tend to be a safe alternative to that for sure. So recommendations for things we should have around for kidding season, for sure. So a clean place for them to kid or to lamb that is confined. Towels, gloves, iodine for dipping things, some kind of, paper to write things down for sure. Something to kind of clean them off with. Some people will use like a bulb syringe or some kind of suction type device for if they when new babies come out, they have kind of schmutz all over their face, and we want them to be able to breathe and kind of get all of that out of there. Medications wise, that's going to be a conversation, with your veterinarian as far as what levels kind of your farm is at, how many things you're kidding out or lambing out, as far as specific drugs to have on hand. But definitely kind of knowing the normals for kidding or lambing. And just very briefly, we don't want more than 30 minutes between kids or lambs. So once active labor starts, we want them to have the first one out or most of the way out within 30 minutes. And then once that next one comes out, we want that one to be out within 30 minutes as well. Again, 2 is pretty normal for them, but they can have 3, 4, 5. They will also then have the placenta. Sometimes there's a placenta per baby. Sometimes they'll have the placenta after a baby and then still have another baby. Other times they'll sort of have multiple babies and then have multiple placentas. Little side note, because I know we've got a lot of horse people here as well, retained placenta is much less scary in goats and sheep than in horses. In horses, it is an absolute emergency situation. Goats and sheep are a little bit hardier, and they can kind of handle it for about 24 hours before we start to mess with them on that. They will oftentimes also eat their placentas. That is normal, and it's not something you necessarily need to stop them from, other than they can sometimes try to eat too much of it at a time and like act like they're going to choke on it. So you want to be a little bit careful about that. I don't have an image of it here, but whenever baby ruminants are born, so goats, sheep, and cows, like I said, they have really small lungs, and we need those lungs to fill with air because they were just full of fluid a couple minutes ago. So there is a specific recovery position. You can probably Google it and get a better image than I'm going to attempt to explain, but basically it is all 4 legs facing forward. So kind of them on their chest with their head facing forward, and then front arms straight out in front of them, and back legs next to their sort of side of their body straight out in front of them. Not on their side, certainly not on their back, and not kind of crumpled. If you've got any concerns about a newborn ruminant, that's the first step, because that allows their lungs to expand fully and have the best shot at getting some air. And then vigorous rubbing with towels and hands and things like that can help to stimulate them and kind of wake them up. Yeah. Are goats related to sheep? They are different species. They are related in that they're both ruminants. Ruminants means that they've got 4 compartments to their stomach. They don't actually have 4 stomachs, as in the number 4, but they do have, I wish I wrote it out, but they do have a forestomach, meaning a before stomach. So they have a stomach just like we do that produces stomach acid, but they've got 3 other sort of little chambers before that that do a bunch of the processing and fermenting and grinding and all that good stuff before it actually gets to their regular stomach. And they have all of those things because they can eat things that we can't. So they can eat hay and grass and other forages that we can't digest. And actually, they can't digest it either, but they have a whole ecosystem of microbes and little protozoa and bacteria and fungus and all kinds of fun things that live in their rumen, and they actually digest the microbes for them, and then they produce some volatile fatty acids, and that's how the goat or sheep gets their energy. So they're related, but not quite the same. Yes? Oh. Am I going to do a seminar on goat breeding? I can, for sure. It wasn't in the plans yet, but we can get it in the plans and we'll get a date out there for sure.
So we have a few more alfalfa questions.
Okay, more alfalfa questions. Got it.
Can you feed does with baby bucks on them alfalfa? And what if, and this is a direct quote, what if your goat is bougie and refuses to eat anything other than alfalfa?
I love that. Okay, so 2 questions. First one, can you feed does with baby bucks on them alfalfa? Answer is yes. The baby bucks on the doe, they're drinking the milk at that point. Yes, they're probably going to try a little bit of the alfalfa, but I'm not super worried about it at that point. It's more so once they are weaned and they are fully on forage that we do want to try to avoid the alfalfa to the best of our ability. I will say avoiding grain, much more important than avoiding alfalfa, because grain can do damage a little bit faster. Plus, again, in castrated males, they don't need the grain. Don't feed boy goats grain. They don't need the calories. But yes, so does can for sure have alfalfa. Does do great on alfalfa, especially milking does. And the baby bucklings can have a little bit of it, but once they're weaned, and especially once they're castrated, no more alfalfa for them. And then the second question was fantastic. The direct quote was, what if your goat is bougie and will only eat alfalfa? Goats were evolved to live on mountains, and mountains don't tend to have alfalfa. I live in Florida, so I don't see a lot of mountains, but I don't think that there's a lot of alfalfa on mountains. So I would say that your goat is a really good human trainer and has done a great job of teaching you how to give them alfalfa. I would do your best to avoid alfalfa and to transition over. You can certainly do that slowly, so you can buy like a Timothy and alfalfa mix or an orchard and alfalfa mixed hay and kind of work towards that, and then kind of slowly transition over. Again, it's a risk-benefit situation. You know, I certainly have some clients and producers that do feed some of their males alfalfa, and they also know that they need to go straight to the UF Animal Hospital if they have a goat that can't pee, and they're prepared to do surgery on that animal, which again is in the thousands of dollars. So it's a risk-benefit situation for sure. I just try to mitigate that risk wherever I can. Okay, I'm being told that I've talked a lot, which I feel it. So I think we're going to wrap it up. I apologize, my thank you slide didn't get on here, but thank you guys so much for all the amazing questions and for coming out. In March, I believe it was March 16th, we are going to do a seminar on wound management. So make sure that you either come in person or check us out on Facebook for that seminar next month. Thank you guys so much for listening.